The courthouse records in Robeson County, North Carolina, tell of 4 sudden deaths between 1977 and 1979. A school principal who collapsed after Sunday service, a local store owner found dead in his bed, a farmer whose heart gave out in the middle of harvest, and a church trustee who slipped away after a long evening meal. What those records don't reveal is that all 4 men were tied to the same grandmotherly woman, and that each death occurred within months of her involvement in their lives. Her name was Velma Barfield, and she looked every bit the sweet Southern lady, soft-spoken, polite, with a Bible in her lap and a smile on her face. But behind that gentle appearance was something darker. She would kill to keep control, and she would do it with a calmness that unsettled everyone who learned the truth. Before we continue with the tale of Velma's quiet killings, let me take you back to the summer of 1976, when a desperate widow in addiction and a whispered thought by lamplight sealed the fate of everyone who trusted her. The Barfield family lived in rural North Carolina, a place of pine trees, tobacco fields, and red clay roads. Velma grew up in a strict household where her father's temper shaped her childhood and where obedience was valued more than independence. By the 1970s, she was in her mid-40s, carrying the image of a hard-working grandmother who had endured tragedy and loss. She had already buried a husband, and her second marriage had ended violently in fire. Left alone, Velma faced what many small-town women feared most: poverty, dependence, and being forgotten. She had begun taking medications for her nerves and pain, and soon the pills ruled her every decision. But Velma was not an ordinary widow. She had a quiet intelligence that allowed her to mask her habits. Neighbors saw a woman who read scripture and led prayers, but few realized how manipulative she could be when her survival was at stake. She knew how to win trust, how to seem harmless, how to make people believe she needed their protection when in truth, she was slowly arranging their destruction. In the Carolina countryside of the late 1970s, people believed deeply in family, faith, and community reputation. A woman's place was often judged by her loyalty to her kin and her church. Velma understood this better than anyone, and she used it like a weapon. She was a woman who had lived through loss, who spoke softly about God's will, and who seemed devoted to helping those around her. But what if devotion could serve a darker purpose? What if kindness could become the perfect disguise? "We stay together," Velma once told a close friend when rumors began circulating about her troubles with money and medication. "Whatever it takes, we stay together and we survive." The law said differently. Debts piled up, prescriptions drained her paycheck, and her reputation as a caregiver was beginning to falter. Velma knew she had to find another way, and so came the thought that would damn her. Men die, husbands die, and widows inherit everything. The first death came in April of 1977, just a year after her second husband's death and months after Velma began courting Stuart Taylor, a widower with his own comfortable home and enough savings to provide security. Stuart had been a logical choice. A steady man in his early 60s, a church-going widower with no young children to interfere, and someone wealthy enough to ease Velma's financial burden. Their relationship bloomed quickly. Stuart, lonely after years without his wife, found Velma's attentiveness irresistible. She cooked his meals, prayed with him, and filled his home with the warmth he had been missing. Within months, he was speaking openly about marriage and about including Velma in his estate. But Stuart Taylor had underestimated the woman who had entered his life. Within weeks of their engagement, he began to feel the sting of Velma's priorities. She seemed more interested in his financial records than in his affection, more focused on which assets would transfer to her name than on wedding plans. When he suggested that they might move to a larger town, away from the whispers of Robeson County, her response was cold and immediate. "We don't leave," she said, her eyes flat behind her glasses. "This is home. Everything we need is here." On the night of April 4th, Stuart sat down to supper with Velma. Neighbors later recalled seeing him wave cheerfully that afternoon, looking fit and healthy. But by midnight he was in agony, vomiting, sweating, his body twisting with pain. Velma called for help, her voice full of panic, claiming he had eaten something bad. By dawn, Stuart Taylor was dead, his body broken down by what doctors initially labeled a heart attack or stomach ulcer. It was a shock, but not unheard of for a man his age. Velma played the grieving fiancé perfectly, her sobs convincing, her appearance pitiful in church as she clutched her Bible and accepted condolences. Few suspected that she had slipped arsenic into his food, a slow-acting poison that left little trace in those days. The funeral drew a crowd. Stewart had been respected, his life admired, his sudden death mourned. Velma stood by his coffin like a woman destroyed by grief. But those closest to her noticed something odd. How quickly she turned her attention to practical matters, securing access to his accounts, speaking with lawyers about his property, ensuring she would not be left vulnerable. Within a few months, Velma was back to visiting church members. Always kind, always helpful, always ready with a prayer. But behind her gentle voice she was searching again. Another man, another household, another chance to secure her future. The second death came that winter, when a farmer named Jennings Barfield, already weakened by age and illness, grew suddenly worse under Velma's care. Jennings had been a proud man, but now he depended on Velma for meals, medication, and companionship. She played the role of devoted caregiver flawlessly. Neighbors praised her devotion, her willingness to sacrifice her time. What they didn't know was that each spoonful of medicine she prepared carried something more, a dose of poison mixed so carefully that his decline seemed natural, almost expected. On the evening of February 3rd, Jennings complained of dizziness and stomach pain. By the next morning he was gone. The doctor signed the certificate without question. Old age, complications, heart failure. Velma stood at another graveside, dressed in black, her shoulders trembling with the weight of sorrow. But those who looked closely noticed that her grief seemed measured, her tears falling more on cue than from the depths of her soul. Within weeks, Velma was once again organizing her affairs. She visited banks, asked questions about insurance, and checked on household accounts. Observers whispered, but no one dared to accuse. After all, who could imagine a grandmotherly churchwoman plotting death with such calculation? But patterns were beginning to form. Men tied to Velma seemed to grow ill, their lives cut short under strange circumstances. Still, in a community where faith and respectability shielded women from suspicion, few spoke their doubts aloud. Velma's circle of trust remained intact, and for now. By the spring of 1978, whispers in Robeson County had grown louder, though no one dared put voice to their suspicions. Velma Barfield still moved through the community with a Bible in her purse and a prayer on her lips. But the people around her had begun to vanish with unsettling regularity. She played the part of the grieving caretaker, but behind her calm demeanor, she was already searching for her next opportunity. It came in the form of John Henry Lee, a retired store owner who had once run a small grocery in Fayetteville. Lee was known for his thrift and for his careful management of money, qualities that made him a respected elder in his church. He had buried his wife some years before and now lived alone, save for the occasional visits of children and grandchildren. When Velma appeared in his life, she seemed like an angel sent by Providence, a widow who understood loneliness, a woman who quoted scripture with sincerity, a caregiver who seemed devoted to easing the burdens of others. Their friendship grew quickly. Velma began visiting regularly, preparing meals, cleaning his house, reading passages from the Bible in the evenings. Neighbors saw Lee brighten in her presence. He began to speak of her fondly, telling friends that Velma was a godsend. What no one realized was that she had already begun studying his habits, his routines, his finances. She knew what accounts he held, what assets remained in his name, and most importantly, how dependent he had become on her daily visits. In July of 1978, John Henry Lee fell violently ill. At first it seemed like a stomach virus, nausea, cramps, fever. Velma fussed over him, urging him to rest, bringing him tea, preparing his food. But as the days passed, his condition worsened, the pain growing unbearable, his body wasting away as though consumed by something inside. Doctors examined him, puzzled but not alarmed. For a man of his age, complications could come swiftly, and death was often close behind. By the end of that month, Lee was gone. Velma played her role with chilling perfection. She wept at his funeral, recited scripture, clasped the hands of mourners with trembling fingers. She told everyone how sudden it had been, how she had prayed at his bedside, how she believed God had simply called him home. Few doubted her story. After all, who would suspect poison in a small southern town where faith in appearances often outweighed suspicion? But Lee had left behind accounts that needed settling, property that required management, and Velma was quick to involve herself. She visited lawyers, spoke with banks, and ensured that any debts or paperwork tied to her were resolved swiftly. She moved with the efficiency of someone who had rehearsed the steps many times before. Yet Velma's need was not only financial. Her dependence on prescription pills had deepened, and each death bought her more time, more resources, more opportunities to maintain her carefully constructed life. She was caught in a cycle of necessity and deceit, each victim feeding her need for survival, each funeral masking a crime that grew bolder with every repetition. The fourth death came less than a year later, and shocked the community more than the rest. Dolly Edwards was not a wealthy landowner or a respected elder. She was Velma's own mother. Dolly had always been a strong woman, rooted in faith and family. She was known in Bladenboro for her hospitality, her devotion to church, and her strict adherence to discipline. Velma often leaned on her, relying on her for companionship and support, though their relationship had long been strained by Velma's dependence on pills. To outsiders, it seemed a natural arrangement, a daughter caring for her aging mother. But in truth, Velma had grown weary of Dolly's disapproval, of her watchful eye, of her unwillingness to provide financial assistance when her daughter came begging. In late 1978, Dolly began to suffer strange bouts of illness. Sharp stomach pains, weakness, dizziness. Velma explained it away to neighbors as just her age, assuring them she was doing everything possible to care for her mother. She prepared her meals, measured her medicine, prayed at her bedside. But instead of recovering, Dolly's condition worsened, each episode more severe than the last. On the evening of December 2nd, Dolly Edwards cried out in agony after supper. Within hours, she was gone. The community was stunned. A woman of her standing, so strong and full of faith, taken so suddenly. The doctor attributed it to heart failure, a common enough cause for a woman of her age. Velma clutched her Bible and played the grieving daughter with a sincerity that few questioned. Her tears flowed freely. Her words of scripture sounded pure, and once again, no one suspected that the very woman who had spoon-fed her mother's last meal had laced it with poison. It was at Dolly's funeral that doubts first began to take root. A few whispered quietly that Velma's misfortune was uncanny. Too many deaths, too many tragedies circling one woman. How could a person endure so much loss and remain so composed? Still, in a community that valued reputation and faith, suspicion remained buried beneath politeness. But there were some who noticed details that didn't fit. A nurse recalled Velma's eagerness to handle all of Dolly's medications herself. A neighbor remarked that Velma always insisted on preparing meals, even when others offered to help. A family friend noted how quickly Velma began sorting through Dolly's financial affairs after the burial, her grief strangely efficient. The authorities had not yet connected the pattern. Each death had been written off as natural, a heart attack, a stroke, a complication of age. No one had performed the tests that might reveal poison in their blood. But behind the scenes, murmurs were beginning to rise. Insurance agents, bank clerks, even church members had begun to note the strange fortune that followed Velma. The way money seemed to shift into her hands after every funeral. For Velma, the pattern was both her salvation and her curse. She relied on it to survive, but with each life taken, the risk of exposure grew. The circle was tightening, though she did not yet realize it. By 1979, Velma was courting another man, Roland Stewart, who had grown close to her after the loss of his wife. Like those before him, he found comfort in Velma's gentle voice, her scripture readings, her home-cooked meals. He saw her as a woman of faith, a companion for his final years. He did not know that she had already begun planning his death. The cycle was about to repeat, but this time suspicion was waiting. By the autumn of 1979, the shadows around Velma Barfield had grown too heavy to ignore. Roland Stewart, her new companion, had taken her into his life with the same trust that so many before him had offered. He was kind, soft-spoken, and wealthy enough to give her security in her later years. Friends saw them together at church, sitting side by side in the front pew, Velma's Bible resting neatly in her lap. To most, it looked like God had granted her another chance at happiness. But those who knew the pattern, those who whispered in small circles, feared he would never live to see another summer. Roland's decline came swiftly. At first it was little things, stomach cramps, fatigue, dizziness after meals Velma prepared. Then came the violent sickness, the vomiting, the sweating that seemed to drain the life from him. Velma stayed by his bedside, praying aloud, holding his hand, insisting to anyone who visited that she was doing everything she could. But in truth, she was doing everything to make sure he never recovered. On the night of February 3, 1980, Roland Stewart cried out in agony, his body writhing from the poison coursing through his veins. Velma called for help, her voice frantic, but by the time the doctor arrived, it was too late. Another sudden death. Another funeral where Velma appeared in black, her face hidden behind a veil of tears. To most, it was a tragic love story cut short. To others, it was yet another coincidence too grim to be chance. But this time, suspicion refused to stay silent. Roland's family had questions. They pressed doctors for answers, demanded tests, and refused to accept the easy explanations of heart failure or old age. His sudden illness had been too violent, too unnatural. When toxicology reports were finally ordered, the truth came spilling out. Roland Stewart had been poisoned. The investigation that followed pulled back the curtain on Velma Barfield's quiet world. Detectives traced her past, reviewing the deaths that had seemed so ordinary at the time. Stuart Taylor, Jennings Barfield, John Henry Lee, Dolly Edwards, each had died suddenly under Velma's care. Each had shown symptoms of poisoning. The pieces began to align, a chain of graves stretching across the late 1970s, all tied to the same grandmotherly figure with the gentle voice and the careful smile. When Velma was questioned, she denied everything at first. She clutched her Bible, spoke of her faith, insisted she had only ever cared for the men and women who had trusted her, but cracks soon appeared in her story. Investigators discovered that she had been filling prescriptions for powerful drugs, collecting arsenic-based poisons, and managing the finances of her victims with a precision that belied her humble image. Bank records, insurance policies, and witnesses all told a story she could no longer hide. Finally, confronted with the evidence, Velma confessed. Her words chilled those in the room. She admitted to poisoning multiple people, explaining that she never meant to be cruel, that she only wanted to ease her burdens, to solve her problems. She spoke of her addiction to pills, of the fear of abandonment, of the desperate need to stay in control. But what horrified investigators most was the calm way she described her actions. There was no madness in her voice, no wildness in her eyes. Velma Barfield killed with calculation, using trust as her weapon and compassion as her disguise. The trial that followed became one of the most sensational cases in North Carolina history. The newspapers called her the death row granny, the sweet-faced killer whose crimes shocked the South. Prosecutors laid out the pattern of poisonings, the trail of bodies that followed her through the late 1970s. They showed how each death benefited her financially, how each victim trusted her completely until their final breath. The defense spoke of her troubled childhood, her abusive father, her dependence on medication, painting her as a woman broken by circumstance. But the jury saw something darker, a woman who understood exactly what she was doing. In November 1978, Velma Barfield was convicted of first-degree murder for the death of Roland Stewart. She became the first woman in the United States to be executed after the Supreme Court reinstated the death penalty in 1976. Her conviction sent ripples through the community that had once embraced her as a woman of faith, a caregiver, a grandmother. To them, the mask had been ripped away, revealing not mercy or weakness, but cold calculation. On November 2, 1984, Velma Barfield was executed by lethal injection at Central Prison in Raleigh, North Carolina. She walked calmly to the chamber, dressed in a plain prison uniform, carrying her Bible as always. Witnesses described her as composed, even serene, as if she had finally accepted the fate she had so often delivered to others. She spoke prayers with her minister, asked forgiveness, and then lay back as the needle pierced her arm. Within minutes, she was gone, the first woman executed in the United States in more than 2 decades. But Velma's story did not end with her death. It raised disturbing questions that linger even today. How could a grandmotherly figure, a woman of faith, commit such crimes in plain sight without suspicion? How many other deaths might have been overlooked, written off as natural causes when in truth they were the result of poison? And what does it say about our assumptions? That a soft voice, a gentle smile, and a Bible could blind us to the darkest of motives? Velma Barfield's crimes forced investigators, doctors, and ordinary citizens to confront the unsettling reality that evil can wear the most familiar face. She was not a shadowy stranger, Not a figure lurking in alleys. She was a neighbor, a caregiver, a woman who baked pies and led prayers. And yet behind every kind gesture, every word of scripture, there was a calculation, a plan, a willingness to kill. The land where her victims once lived carries on. Farms still planted, churches still filled with hymns, families still gathering for Sunday suppers. But for those who remember, the story of Velma Barfield remains a chilling reminder. It shows us that trust can be twisted into a weapon, that compassion can mask cruelty, and that monsters sometimes hide behind the faces of angels. Today, Velma's name is spoken in hushed tones in true crime circles. Her story preserved in documentaries and books. She has become a symbol of betrayal, the grandmother who poisoned those who loved her most. And when people in North Carolina tell her story, they speak of the dangers of assuming innocence based on appearances, of how the sweetest smile can conceal the deadliest intent. So when you hear the tale of Velma Barfield, remember this: evil does not always announce itself with violence or fury. Sometimes it comes softly, with a gentle voice, a warm meal, and a prayer at the bedside. Sometimes it looks like the very person you would trust with your life.